The wind remembers. It carries whispers from an age before empires, before men drew borders on the skin of the earth. In that ancient silence between frost and fire, between dawn and the endless night, something sacred was born. The Celts, wanderers of the mist and keepers of forgotten wisdom, carved their spirals into stone, seeking the rhythm that binds heaven and soil. They believed that the world was alive, that every tree spoke in symbols, every river carried memory, and every breath was a prayer returning to its source. To them, the north was not the world's edge, but its beginning, a place of origin where creation still breathed in its purest form. The Greeks called it Hyperborea, the realm beyond the north wind, where the air shimmered with divine light and no shadow could endure. Yet what for the Greeks was a legend, for the Celts was a lived truth. Their myths did not seek escape from the earth but communion with it. The circle, their eternal symbol, was not only art but metaphysics, life and death as one movement, spirit forever flowing back into itself. Theirs was a civilization of reverence, not conquest. They did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. Every tool, every song, every ritual gesture was part of the same cosmic dialogue. Their gods were not distant rulers but companions walking through forests and rain. The Druids' wisdom was not about possession, but perception, the ability to see the invisible geometry behind all living things. And when the light of Greece began to fade, it was the Celts who carried its flame into the mist. They translated the southern clarity into northern endurance, a spirituality of silence, endurance, and awe before mystery. From them the European spirit inherited its depth, the strength that is calm, the faith that questions, the longing that listens. This is not just the story of a people long vanished. It is the story of how Europe found its soul in the cold winds of the north, where thought became myth, and myth became memory. These are the echoes of the north, still resonating through the stones, the stars, and the heart of humankind. The Celts and the ancient world. In the depths of the ancient imagination lived a haunting conviction that beyond the borders of civilization, past the last Roman roads and the vanishing echo of Greek thought, there stretched another world. It was a place without geometry or law, where the rhythm of nature dictated time, and the human spirit was still raw, untamed, and immense. To the south, this world was a mystery. To the north, it was home. And in that world, wrapped in fog and wind, among granite cliffs and emerald forests, dwelled the Celts, a people who stood both inside and outside history. The Greeks called them barbarians. Yet that word, for once, seemed too small. There was something in these northern tribes that unsettled and fascinated the classical mind. They were not the shapeless chaos of the primitive. They were chaos alive with meaning. Their strength was terrible, but their poetry was tender, their rites wild, but their philosophy profound. They did not build marble cities, yet they understood eternity as deeply as Plato or Heraclitus. Theirs was a wisdom not of the academy, but of the storm. The ancient world both feared and revered them. When Celtic warriors appeared on the horizon painted, singing, unafraid of death, even Rome trembled. They fought not merely for victory but for the echo of something sacred. Their courage was rooted in their faith that death did not end the story, only transformed it. Life was a spiral, not a line. Every fall was a return, every wound a passage into a higher realm. To the disciplined Roman legions, such men seemed possessed, and perhaps they were, by forces the South no longer understood. They raised no temples of stone, for the world itself was their temple. The forest was their cathedral, the wind their prayer, the thunder their God's voice. To enter the grove was to enter eternity. They did not separate the sacred from the natural. The divine pulsed in every leaf, every flame, every silence. Their gods were not distant rulers enthroned in marble halls, but living presences woven into rain, river, and fire. To the Celts, nature was not a background for existence. It was existence luminous, infinite, alive. To the eyes of a Roman, this was both terrifying and sublime. The Celt appeared as a creature from another order of being, a man who belonged to the world before the world was divided into reason and faith, body and spirit. He was the barbarian of a higher order, of fierce, but radiant with a strange purity, untamed, yet guided by an inner law no empire could comprehend. He did not conquer, he belonged. He did not own, he revered. Thus, in the mirror of the Celt, the ancient world glimpsed its forgotten reflection of the original self it had buried beneath its temples and laws. The Celt was the living memory of what humanity once was before it learned to call itself civilized, the guardian of the sacred wild, the echo of the world's first music. Beyond the marble calm of Rome and the reasoned light of Greece, he stood as a reminder that there are truths which can only be found in the wind, in the storm, and in the trembling silence of the forest. The image of the barbarian of a higher order of the Celts existed in a liminal realm between nature and civilization, between the fire of magic and the light of reason. They were neither the destroyers of the world nor its slaves. They were its transformers. Their so-called barbarism was not the absence of culture, but its raw, untamed beginning, the moment when form had not yet conquered spirit, and life still vibrated with the energy of creation itself. For the Greeks, the Celts became a mirror in which they glimpsed the wholeness they had long since lost. In these northern warriors, half poet and half seer, the Hellenic world saw its forgotten self, a world before the walls of the polis, before philosophy dissected mystery into logic. The Celt embodied what the Greek mind had once known but buried, the sacred bond between human breath and the living earth. Thus, the ancient writers from Herodotus to Posidonius spoke of them with fascination and unease. They described men whose bodies belonged to the storm, yet whose souls touched eternity. There was savagery in their battle cry, but refinement in their silence. Blood on their hands, yet vision in their eyes. They lived by the rhythm of the elements, by a faith older than language, the faith that the divine was not somewhere above the world, but within it. In their songs thundered both war and worship. In their feasts, fire was not indulgence but offering. In the stillness of their oak groves, one could feel that strange duality that terrified the Romans and enchanted the Greeks, of the meeting of body and spirit, instinct and contemplation. The Celt did not divide these realms. He walked between them, whole and unbroken. To the civilized world, he seemed a paradox, the barbarian radiant with nobility, a wanderer who carried eternity in his silence. And perhaps that is why, even centuries later, the phrase "a barbarian of a higher order" still lingers, for he was not the opposite of civilization, but its forgotten root, the place where wisdom and wildness meet, and the human soul remembers that it too was born of the wind. The Celtic civilization as a bridge between antiquity and the north. The Celts stood between two worlds, the luminous order of the ancient south, and the mist-veiled mystery of the north. They were the living bridge over which myths, symbols, and sacred ideas crossed from one tradition to another. To the Greeks and Romans, they were the guardians of a threshold, mediators between the geometry of civilization and the boundless breadth of the untamed. Through them, the rational spirit of the Mediterranean met the primeval faith of the north, and something entirely new was born. It was through Celtic lands that the ancient world first touched the archaic soul of Europe, the whisper of forests, the cult of the oak, the reverence for wind and stone. From this encounter emerged the prelude to what would later become the Norse mythos, a vision of the divine not as serene harmony, but as sacred struggle, the cosmos forged in ice and fire. The Celts carried fragments of Hyperborean memory. the echo of an age when gods still walked among mortals, and the sun was a living intelligence circling above the polar dawn. For the south, the north had long been a horizon of fear, the land of cold and silence, of twilight without end. But through the Celts, this fear transformed into revelation. The north became not merely a direction of wind and geography, but a metaphysical idea, a symbol of endurance, purity, and eternal return. It was the place where death turned into light, where frost preserved truth, and where every breath was an act of worship. The Celts gave this north a soul. They sanctified its landscapes and revealed its spiritual geometry. The spirals of their art mirrored the spirals of existence, the endless cycles of life and renewal. In their myths, the north was no longer exile but initiation, not the end of the world, but its silent heart. Through them, Europe discovered that the journey toward the north was not merely a passage across land, it was a movement of the soul toward transcendence, a return to the eternal source of light that shines even in the darkest storm. The Celts and the Hyperborean mythology in the luminous dreamscape of ancient Greece. There existed a legend of a people who lived beyond the breath of the north wind. They were called the Hyperboreans, dwellers of a land where the sun never sets, where winter is unknown, and where sorrow and death have no dominion. It was said that there, under the eternal spring, humanity lived in harmony with the divine, a world untouched by decay, glowing with the first light of creation. Philosophers and poets of antiquity often wondered if this northern paradise was merely a myth or a distant memory of a real people. As trade routes and wars carried them farther north, they began to whisper that the Hyperboreans might not be imaginary after all, that they could be the Celts, those fierce and radiant tribes living at the edge of the known world, the fog-shrouded lands of Britain, the green hills of Gaul, and the windswept shores of Iberia seemed to them the threshold of that celestial realm where the gods rest and the world renews its breath. In the imagination of the classical world, the Celtic lands became the western reflection of that polar Eden, the far sanctuary where the sun itself paused to rest before beginning its eternal cycle again. The Hyperborean myth, once a distant dream of philosophers, took root in the Celtic soil and blossomed into a new spiritual geography. The north was no longer a realm of exile and frost, but a place of return, the hidden heart of the world, the memory of paradise. The Celts, inheriting this myth, transformed it from cosmological legend into a vision of the soul. For them, the Hyperborean realm was not merely a faraway land but an inward journey, the state of being where the human spirit becomes transparent to the divine. Their Druids spoke of the soul's migration not as a punishment, but as a pilgrimage back to the luminous north, the source of all beginnings. Thus, the Hyperborean myth lived on in Celtic memory. Transfigured into something more than myth, it became a symbol of the spiritual north, a remembrance of the world before the fall, of the eternal dawn that still glimmers in the depths of human longing. To travel toward that north was to seek not geography, but grace, not a continent of ice and wind, but the homeland of the soul, the place where time stands still and the sun never dies. The idea of the Northern Golden Age, of the birth of the Nordic tradition. Within the ancient myth of Hyperborea lies the seed of what would one day become the Nordic tradition, the vision of the North as a lost center, a primordial homeland of light. For the ancients, the North was not merely a point on the map, nor a place of frost and distance. It was an inner direction, the compass of the soul turning toward the source of purity, where being itself was untouched, clear, and whole. When the Celts looked upon their rugged cliffs, their gray seas, their mountains crowned with mist, they did not see exile or barrenness. They saw a threshold, the shimmering edge between worlds. To journey northward was to move closer to the divine, To cross its seas was to cross from mortality into mystery. For them, the North was not the end of the earth, it was the beginning of creation. Their legends are filled with heroes who sail beyond the sea, who pass into unseen lands and return transformed, not as conquerors, but as initiates. These were not mere voyages of exploration, but pilgrimages of the spirit. Beyond the western waves or the northern horizon lay Tir Nanog, the land of the ever-young, a place where time sleeps, and souls remember who they are. Every journey toward that horizon was a rite of passage, every return a rebirth. Thus, out of the Celtic imagination and the Hyperborean myth was born the spiritual current that would later be called the Nordic tradition, a lineage of the cold light, of the silence in which eternity breathes. It is a wisdom born not of warmth and abundance, but of clarity, restraint, and reverence. It is the understanding that truth is not found in the noise of the world, but in the stillness of the snow-covered forest. That the heart of winter can contain the memory of paradise. The northern golden age is not a time long past, it is a state of being, a remembrance within the human spirit of a time when heaven and earth were one. And so, the North endures, not only as a landscape, but as an axis of the soul, a symbol of return to the eternal dawn that never fades, even when the world sleeps in darkness. Druids and the Celtic worldview. If the philosopher of the South sought truth through the pathways of logic, the Druid of the North sought it through the silence of the oak. He did not argue, he listened. For him, wisdom was not born in words but in stillness, not in conquest but in communion. The rustle of leaves, the whisper of water, the slow pulse of the earth, these were his scriptures. The Druids were more than priests. They were the guardians of memory, the healers of both body and spirit, the poets who bound words to eternity, and the judges who held justice as sacred as breath itself. In their presence, the tribes remembered who they were. Their teachings were never written, for truth was considered too alive to be imprisoned in symbols, it had to be carried from heart to heart. Like fire passed from torch to torch. They taught that all things from the brightest star to the humblest stone were threads in one vast, breathing web of being. To harm a tree was to wound oneself. To look upon the sky was to see one's own reflection. Humanity was not the master of nature, but its expression, a single rhythm in the great song of creation. In this vision, religion and nature were not separate. The forest itself was the temple, and the wind was its hymn. Every dawn was a resurrection. Every river, a sermon of flow and transformation. To be alive was already to be sacred. Through the Druids, the Celts gave Europe a vision of unity, a sense that the divine was not distant or abstract, but pulsing through every living thing. Their wisdom whispered of a world where knowing meant remembering, and where to listen deeply was the highest act of faith. Contacts with the Germanic peoples and cultural kinship. On the northern borders of the Celtic world lived the Germanic tribes, a younger, wilder branch of the same Indo-European lineage. Between them flowed not only rivers of war but also currents of exchange of symbols, myths, and sacred sounds. Gods crossed these invisible borders as easily as winds. The thunder of Taranis echoed in Thor. The wisdom of Lugus resonated in Odin. What began as distant kinship slowly wove itself into a shared spiritual fabric. Through centuries of encounter, conflict, and mingling, these two worlds, Celtic and Germanic, began to mirror one another. Both revered the ancestors and the sanctity of blood. Both saw in battle not merely destruction but sacrifice, but dialogue with the divine. Their rituals of offering, their poetic vision of fate, their sense of an unseen order binding all things, all spoke the same language of the North. From this exchange was born the archetype of the northern soul. a consciousness that knows both storm and silence, both the call of war and the longing for transcendence. It is a world where strength is not cruelty, but clarity, where courage is not defiance, but harmony with destiny. Thus, the meeting of Celts and Germans was not the clash of strangers, but the recognition of kin. Out of their shared myths arose a single spiritual horizon, the idea that blood and spirit are but two reflections of one being, and that in the cold light of the north, man and God remember their common origin. The Celtic religion, and the challenge of Reconstruction today. The Celtic faith reaches us only through fragments, the cautious words of Roman chroniclers, the misted echoes of medieval legends, the silent testimony of stones buried in the earth. And yet, through these scattered remains, one can sense an underlying harmony, a worldview where the cosmos was not divided between life and death, heaven and earth, but united in one vast rhythm of transformation. To the Celts, the boundary between the living and the dead was porous, almost transparent. Existence flowed like a river from source to sea, from sea to cloud, from cloud to rain, and again to the river. Nothing truly ended. It merely changed its form, its rhythm, its tone. Death was not annihilation but return, a homecoming to the source of being. Their faith was not a theology written in scrolls, but a philosophy whispered by the wind and mirrored in the seasons. Every leaf that fell, every sunrise, every returning bird was a revelation of the eternal cycle, the teaching that life renews itself through surrender, that decay is but another name for transformation. The Celts intuited what later philosophers would call the eternal return, that understanding that all things are bound by one energy, endlessly dying and being reborn. In that rhythm, they found meaning not in permanence, but in flow, not in possession, but in participation. Thus, even in fragments, the Celtic religion speaks with a strange wholeness. It reminds us that we, too, are part of that same current. To live is to move, to die is to change, and to remember the cycle is to awaken to the divine pulse that moves through all worlds. Celtic and Norse mythology, foundations for a unified vision. At the heart of Sharakova's work lies a profound intuition that Celtic and Norse mythologies are not separate stories, but two harmonizing voices of the same northern tradition. They are twin reflections of one spiritual landscape, shaped by wind, stone, and silence. One speaks through the mystic poetic, melancholic, druidic, the other through the storm austere, heroic, crystalline. Yet beneath these differing tones lies a single pulse, the call of the north as a path toward the center, not the geographical pole, but the axis of the soul. The Celts dreamed of the otherworld hidden beyond the horizon of seas and mists. The Norse saw Yggdrasil, the world tree binding heaven, earth, and underworld. Both sought not escape from the world, but reunion with its inner order, the divine symmetry beneath chaos. In both, the sacred journey was not an ascent away from life, but a return to its heart. Sharakova sees in these traditions the remnants of a primordial wisdom, a metaphysics of courage and transformation, where the divine reveals itself through endurance, and truth is found not in abstraction, but in the clarity of cold light. The North, in this vision, is not a wasteland but a mirror. Its icy silence reflects the soul's most ancient longing. Thus begins her exploration, not merely of Celts and Germans, but of the eternal human quest for the light beyond the known world. It is a story of those who walk the edge of the map, seeking the fire hidden in frost. For them, barbarism is not savagery, but remembrance, or memory of the time when spirit and nature still spoke the same language, and freedom meant harmony with the infinite. Ideas of the far north in Antiquity and European culture. The north is not merely the direction of the wind. It is the world's memory of its own beginning. In the ancient soul lived a strange longing, the yearning for the north. Not for its storms or cold, but for what lay beyond them. A primordial calm where the sun never sets. Where gods walk closer than men. And life itself is only the reflection of a light that knows no night. The Greeks called that land the realm of the Hyperboreans, those who dwell beyond the north wind, beyond Boreas. At the very edge of the inhabited world. To them was attributed eternal youth, purity, harmony. In these myths echoed the dream of a lost golden age, an age when man was still one with heaven, when spirit and nature spoke the same tongue. But over time, myth began to descend into geography. Hyperborean of Abdera wrote of a vast island lying opposite Celtic, inhabited by luminous beings, the Hyperboreans. Others placed their home in the Alps, or in the mysterious mountains from which the Danube sprang. Thus, legend acquired coordinates. The sacred moved from the sky to the earth. And in this descent, the Celts emerged, people of mists and oak groves, of silence and iron. To the Greeks and Romans, they seemed the descendants of the Hyperboreans, noble barbarians, guardians of an ancient wisdom that the marble cities of the south had long forgotten. Through them, the myth of the north found a new face, not of gods in radiant lands, but of men whose hearts still remembered the breath of that timeless dawn. For the Celts, the north was not exile, it was origin. It was the place where the world began to dream. Ultima Thule, the island at the edge of the world. For the ancient imagination, there existed at the world's edge a final island, Thule, Ultima Thule, the last land before the abyss of the unknown. It was the threshold of existence, where the maps of men dissolved into mist. The Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia, who in the 4th century BC dared to sail beyond the boundaries of the known world, spoke of this mysterious place. He wrote that the sea there became neither liquid nor solid, but something in between, the living substance of water, ice, and fog, and that the sun lingered above the horizon for endless days, refusing to set. For the Greeks, Thule was not merely a remote island, but a symbol of the limit, a line where the human ends and the otherworld begins. It marked the border between the visible and the sacred, the known and the ineffable. In truth, Thule was not only a place upon the map, but a reflection of the human soul. Each of us carries within a secret Thule, at final horizon of reason where knowledge falls silent and faith begins to speak. It is the moment when exploration becomes initiation, when the voyage outward turns into a journey inward, and toward the shimmering edge of one's own being, where the sun of spirit never sets. The voyage of Pytheas of Massalia. Pytheas was the first to draw close to that ultimate north, the first to step beyond the threshold where the known dissolves into wonder. Sailing from Massalia, he ventured past the familiar shores of Britain and entered the silent latitudes of perpetual twilight, where the sun hovers forever on the edge of the horizon and the sea breathes with a slow, eternal rhythm. His words were met with disbelief. The scholars of antiquity doubted him, unable to accept that a man could reach a realm where time itself falters, where day and night lose their boundaries. Yet Pytheas had glimpsed something that reason could not yet name, a world where myth and reality touched. In his accounts, the sea was no longer merely water. It became a threshold, a mirror reflecting the metaphysical order of the cosmos. His journey transformed the northern mists into a bridge between mythic imagination and lived experience. From that moment on, the north was no longer a fantasy, it became a question, a mystery not of distance, but of meaning. The symbolism of the North in ancient thought. For the thinkers of antiquity, the North was far more than a place of cold and wind. It was a direction of the spirit, a path leading toward purity and transcendence. Each quarter of the world carried its own metaphysical meaning. The East was birth and awakening, the South a growth and abundance, the West a decline and dusk. But the North was silence, contemplation, the return to origins, somewhere beyond Boreas. They imagined the dwelling place of the gods, and the souls of the heroic dead were realm untouched by corruption or decay. The northern paradise mirrored the Garden of Eden. One lay in the dawnlit east, the other in the frozen light of the north. Yet both spoke of the same sacred space, the center of the world, the axis where all cycles begin and end. To journey northward was, therefore, not a movement across the earth, but an ascent through layers of being from the visible to the eternal. The North was not the absence of warmth. It was the presence of clarity, a place where the soul, purified by frost, remembers the first breath of creation. René Guénon and the Hyperborean tradition as a source of spiritual initiation across millennia. The myth of Hyperborea seemed to fade into legend until the 20th century, when the philosopher René Guénon returned it to the realm of meaning. In his vision, Hyperborea was not a lost land, but a memory of the primordial axis of humanity, the sacred center that existed before religions were divided and nations were born. Guénon wrote that Thule, the mystical North, represented the first spiritual pole of the earth, the origin from which all true wisdom once radiated. There, at the dawn of time, was preserved what he called the primordial tradition, a pure and direct knowledge of the divine, untainted by dogma and myth, or the fractures of history. When that center withdrew from human reach, its light reappeared in other forms in Atlantis, in the civilizations that followed, in every fragment of sacred knowledge scattered across the ages. But each of them was only a shadow of the original northern light. In Guénon's metaphysics, the Druidic tradition stood as a surviving thread of this lineage, a meeting point between the Hyperborean and Atlantean currents. The Celts, in his eyes, were not merely a people of forests and mist. They were guardians of continuity, vessels through which the memory of the North still breathed. It is as if the land itself, the cliffs of Britain, the stone circles of Ireland, the whispering winds of Gaul held within them a residual vibration of that ancient world. Through their myths, their rituals, and the silent knowledge of the Druids, the Celts preserved a trace of the first initiation, the remembrance that the true North is not a direction in space, but a state of the soul. The Celts and the Northern Archetypes. Thus was born the Nordic tradition, not as a study of peoples or customs, but as a metaphysics of the North, a vision of the world where geography dissolves into symbolism. The Celts became its first bearers, custodians of a memory older than civilization itself. Their Druids were priests of light and mist, interpreters of the unseen, those who could hear the pulse of eternity in the whisper of trees and the rhythm of rain. For them, the North was not a pole, it was a heart, the still center of existence. In its frost lived the courage of endurance, in its pale skies the lucidity of spirit, and in its vast silence the breath of the gods. The northern wind was not merely cold, it was purification, a reminder that the essence of life is not warmth, but clarity. The Celts carried within their midst the hoe of an ancient order, a world where human and divine were still intertwined, where every stone and stream held meaning, and where truth was not learned, but remembered. Even now, as the earth turns endlessly beneath new suns, the axis of that primordial North still lies within the human soul, the place where we no longer seek comfort, but awakening. Archaeological bridges, traces of an ancient kinship. A north is not a boundary, but a beginning. From its mists came the peoples who carried with them the breath of primordial memory. Between the mountains and seas of ancient Europe stretched invisible paths, not just trade routes, but veins of spirit, along which the early tribes exchanged more than bronze or amber. They shared symbols, gestures, and dreams. Archaeology preserves this silent dialogue in the earth. Bronze swords engraved with spirals, solar discs of hammered gold, intricate triskelies that seem to repeat one another's rhythm, as though shaped by different hands, but guided by the same inner design. Across the plains of northern Europe rise the burial mounds of the Bronze Age, stone hills where warriors slept within the earth, their tombs facing the dawn. Death here was not an ending but a reunion, a return to the womb of the soil. The same sacred geometry, the circle, the spiral, the triple sign of motion reappears among the Celts of Gaul and the British Isles, forming a visual language of the North, a grammar of eternity understood by all its children. This was no coincidence. By the 2nd millennium BC, unseen currents were already flowing between the Baltic and the Atlantic, waves of ideas, beliefs, and rites that bound the continent into one mythic whole. As the historian Navarro once wrote, it was not peoples who entered the North. It was the North that sent out its life breath across Europe. The North was not the edge of the known world. It was its source, the fountainhead from which both myth and civilization began to flow. In its frozen silence, the heart of Europe was already beating. Trade and craft as a path of spiritual exchange. Copper and tin, amber and salt, as such were the visible currencies of ancient trade. But beneath this material current flowed another, subtler river, the exchange of symbols and meanings. Along with the metal came songs, ornaments, and patterns that crossed frontiers and languages, carrying with them fragments of myth. What began as craft gradually became metaphysics in form. From the north, the Celts brought back not only weapons from Scandinavia but an entire aesthetic vision, the weight of the blade balanced by the grace of the line. Iron merged with ornament, function fused with spirit. Every crafted object seemed to hold a silent belief that matter itself must be ensouled, transformed by the hand that understands its inner rhythm. In return, the Celts shared with their northern neighbors their jewelry forms, metalworking techniques, and above all their sense of beauty as mystery. In the interweaving of trade and art, something larger than economy took shape, a shared intuition that the visible world is sacred when it bears the imprint of spirit. Thus, every carved spiral, every pattern on a sword's hilt became not just decoration, but a prayer in metal, a reflection of the idea that creation, whether of a tool, a melody, or a myth, is itself an act of worship. Shared traits of the warrior culture. On the ancient burial mounds where bronze swords still rest beneath the soil, one can sense a single and broken truth. War was not mere battle. It was a sacred act. For both Celts and Germanic tribes, the warrior was not an executioner but a priest of blood, performing the ritual of balance between the worlds. To spill blood was not to destroy, but to renew the cosmic order. Courage, for these northern peoples, was a form of immortality. Death on the battlefield was not an end, but a return to the source, to the eternal frost where the souls of heroes are warmed by the cold of the stars. The sword became both offering and symbol, the axis uniting the realms of men and gods. Thus emerged the northern archetype of the warrior, not the destroyer, but the guardian of order, the one who fights not for conquest, but for alignment with the divine rhythm of the world. From this archetype would later grow the spirit of chivalry, The idea of the heroic death as a form of ascent at the moment when man meets God not in prayer, but in the flame of his final act. This worldview transformed warfare into a sacrament of courage. Binding death and transcendence in a single gesture, the warrior's step toward eternity. Mythic symbols, the sun, the tree, and the circle, their myths spoke the same language, that of light and renewal, of roots and return. For both Celts and Norsemen, the sun was not merely a celestial sphere but a living being, a wheel of fate rolling eternally across the heavens. Each sunset was not death but descent, each dawn, a resurrection. In its daily journey they saw the rhythm of existence itself, the endless cycle of fall and return, of trial and illumination. At the center of their cosmos stood the world tree. The Celts saw it as the oak, the Germanic tribes as the ash, Yggdrasil. Yet its essence was the same, the axis mundi, the spine of creation connecting all realms. Its roots drank from the underworld, its trunk rose through the domain of men, and its crown touched the luminous dwelling of gods. Everything that lived drew life from its sap. To cut a tree was to wound the world. To stand beneath its branches was to feel the pulse of eternity. In this sacred cosmology, even the stone had a soul, and the wind a memory. The universe was not dead matter but a circle of breath, a vast, breathing organism where every form, from the smallest leaf to the highest star, carried within it a spark of the divine order. Northern symbolism in Celtic art. When we gaze upon Celtic ornamentation and interlacing lines, the spirals that seem to dissolve into infinity, we are not merely looking at decoration. We are looking into the mirror of the northern sky. These patterns are frozen movements of wind, echoes of starlight over misty plains. They are the pulse of the Arctic light, captured in bronze, gold, and stone, a rhythm not of geometry, but of breathing, and like the symmetry of the Mediterranean world. Celtic art is born from another order, a living balance, always in motion. It is not constructed, but grown. Every curve and twist feels organic, as if drawn by the same invisible current that shapes clouds, rivers, and constellations. The Celts saw the world not as architecture, but as a woven fabric of life, without a fixed center, without boundaries, only the eternal flow of being. That is why scholars call Celtic art the first chapter of European aesthetics. From its spirals and knots will later emerge the stained glass of Gothic cathedrals, the illuminated manuscripts of medieval monks, and even the modern search for abstraction, the attempt to find once again the path from form to spirit. The North as the mirror of the soul. The Celts and the peoples of the North were not two separate cultures, they were two reflections of a single ancient memory. They spoke in different tongues, yet kept silence about the same truth, that life and death are not opposites, but a circle drawn beneath the eternal cold of heaven. For them, the North was never a place on a map. It was a state of being, the inner landscape where a human learns to be simple, pure, and unafraid. To live in the North was to stand face to face with infinity, to feel how the wind strips away illusion, leaving only essence. The cold did not numb, he clarified, if Europe was born from the meeting of North and South. The Celts were its first mediators, carrying across the twilight frontier not gold, but light, a crystalline intelligence, a calm and luminous mind in which myth becomes philosophy, and philosophy, once again, becomes a form of prayer. The North, in their vision, was both mirror and teacher. To To look into it was to see oneself stripped of masks, shaped by silence. It is the place where the soul remembers its origin, clear as frost, and vast as the winter sky. Cosmogony, creation from chaos. The world is born anew with every dawn. And if one listens closely to the morning, one can hear the gods weaving the fabric of being again. For the Celt, myth was never merely a story, it was an act of participation in the eternal rhythm of creation. Every ritual, every offering, every spark struck from flint was a reenactment of the first moment of awakening of order from the vast, breathing darkness of chaos. To claim a patch of earth, to build a home, to kindle a flame, these were not mundane gestures. They were echoes of divine work. Each act of human life repeated, in miniature, the primordial act of the gods, turning chaos once more into cosmos. But in this vision, creation was never final. All that is formed must dissolve. Just as night inevitably follows day, destruction was not the enemy of life, it was its hidden pulse, the necessary silence before the next word of the universe. Thus the Celtic cosmos was not linear but circular, the living wheel of becoming. Everything that dies returns to its source. Everything broken is remade. Existence itself was seen as a sacred breath, endlessly inhaled and exhaled by the divine. And in that rhythm, the Celt found both the meaning of life and the courage to face its impermanence, for to perish was simply to return into the song of creation. Pantheon and the gods of living nature. The Celtic gods were not distant beings dwelling above the clouds, they were currents of life itself, forces that flowed through every stone, every river, every tree, through war and through love. Their pantheon was not a hierarchy carved in marble. It was a living breath, a rhythm of elements that pulsed in all things. The Good Father carried his inexhaustible cauldron, a vessel of fertility and generosity, from which none could depart hungry. His presence was the abundance of the earth itself, the swelling of grain, the warmth of harvest, the laughter of hearth and feast. The Radiant One was the god of light and craft, the warrior whose intelligence shone brighter than his spear. In him wisdom and strength were not opposites but reflections, like the blade that cuts and the hand that heals. He was the patron of every art that gives form to chaos. Brigid, the flame of inspiration, was goddess of fire, poetry, and the sacred word. She was not only the spark that forges iron but also the spark that ignites the heart. Her speech was the very breath of creation, turning silence into music, thought into song. And among them stood Ogma, whom Shirokova calls the god who binds. Like Odin in the north, he united words and destinies. His chains were not of iron but of meaning, the invisible threads of persuasion and enchantment. He was the master of the tongue, the one who could halt armies not by force, but by speech, for in his voice dwelt the magic of order, the power to weave and unweave the world. In this pantheon, each deity was not a symbol but a presence, a rhythm of life itself. The Celts did not worship their gods, they breathed with them. To speak to the wind, to carve a spiral, to light a fire, all these were prayers. Their religion was not belief but participation, not submission but harmony. The divine was not above, it was within the living world, whispering through every leaf and heartbeat. All things are connected, and all things are sacred. Teutates and the sacrifice of renewal. Among the gods of the Celts stood Teutates, a guardian of the tribe, a warrior protector, whose very name meant the god of the people. He was not only a defender in battle but also the keeper of the bond between mortals and the divine. His presence was fierce yet paternal, demanding not cruelty but communion, a sacred act through which life was renewed. For Teutates, blood was not violence, it was the language of the covenant. To the Celts, the offering of life, whether human or symbolic, was not an end but a bridge, an exchange of breath between worlds. When they cast their gifts into rivers and lakes, swords, coins, or even human hearts, the waters received them as vessels of purification. The depths took away not only the offerings, but also the weight of fear, pain, and imbalance that clung to the tribe. In this vision, sacrifice was never an act of death. It was the restoration of cosmic order, the breathing out that made possible a new inhalation of life. The Celts believed that to give was to return, and that the gods, in turn, gave back through rain, harvest, and victory. Thus, every offering to Teutates was a gesture of renewal, a reminder that existence itself is founded on exchange between sky and earth, man and divinity, life and death. The blood that touched the water was not a symbol of ending, but of continuity, a spark cast back into the eternal cycle, where every loss becomes a seed of resurrection. Rituals and the magic of the word. For the Celts, the word was not sound, it was action. To speak was to create, to command the elements, to open the gates between worlds. Words could heal or destroy, bind fate or set it free. They were threads of reality itself, invisible yet unbreakable, and the one who knew how to weave them could alter the fabric of existence. Thus arose the doctrine of the sacred word, the belief that every name carries within it the essence of what it names. To utter a name was to touch the being itself, to awaken its hidden power. That is why the true names of gods were kept in secret, spoken only in ritual whispers, guarded like living fire. For to misuse a name was to wound the balance of the world. The Druids, masters of this invisible art, understood that speech and silence were two sides of the same mystery. Silence was not absence, it was the vessel of meaning, the breath before the word. In the groves where they gathered, they practiced the highest form of magic. Listening. To listen, said the wise, is to hear the rhythm of creation itself, the slow pulse of the universe, where gods and mortals breathe together in one eternal cadence. Their rituals were not performances, but acts of alignment, moments when the voice of man echoed the voice of the divine. And so, for the Celts, to speak was to shape reality, and to remain silent was to guard its sanctity. Between word and silence lay the mystery of all creation, the secret heartbeat of the world. Cosmogony and eschatology, the eternal return of the world, the Celts believed, was not built once and forever, it was woven anew with every breath of the gods. Creation was not a single act, but a rhythm, a pulse of expansion and collapse. Just as the sea withdraws only to return, so too must the cosmos dissolve into shadow before being reborn in light. For them, the end of the world was never tragedy, it was transformation. The death of an age did not mean oblivion, but renewal. Every destruction was the clearing of the field for a new sowing. The Celts saw in the cycle of nature, the falling leaf, the returning spring, the turning of the sun, the very mirror of divine time. Everything returns. As the sun rises after winter, as the green shoots rise from the ashes of fire, so the world itself is reborn from its own ruins. In this cosmic rhythm, there is no true end, only the eternal circulation of being. The myths of creation and destruction were not mere stories. They were blueprints of existence. To die was to return to the source, to rejoin the current from which all things flow. Thus, Celtic eschatology was not about fear of the final day, it was about faith in the circle that never breaks. The universe, they believed, endlessly renews itself until humankind learns the ultimate lesson, that even in destruction, the divine continues to shine quietly, perpetually, through every fragment of the fallen world. The cult of ancestors and the vision of the otherworld for the Celts. Death was not an ending but a passage, a silent crossing from one shore of existence to another. The boundary between the living and the dead was never a wall, but a river, a mist, a hill glowing at dusk, a places where the two worlds touched and recognized each other. The soul did not vanish. It changed its garment. When a person died, their essence returned to the current of life, becoming wind that moves through forests, a bird gliding over the sea, a spark of light trembling on the surface of water. Death was a metamorphosis, not a loss. This is why the Celts spoke not of the end, but of the return. To remember the ancestors was to feel them still near, breathing through the same wind, watching through the same stars. Their presence sanctified the land. Every stone, every river could be an altar, a doorway to the other world, that luminous realm where souls rested between cycles, waiting for their next embodiment. The cult of ancestors was thus more than reverence, it was a cosmology in miniature. Life and death were two rhythms of the same heartbeat, the inhalation and exhalation of eternity. In honoring those who had gone before, the Celts affirmed the truth that no spirit ever truly departs, it merely shifts its form within the great, breathing unity of existence. To die, then, was to return home and to the deeper side of the same world. Nature as a living icon for the Celts. Nature was not scenery, it was scripture. The world itself was a sacred manuscript written in wind and water, in the pulse of roots beneath the soil, and the turning of the stars above. Every leaf was a syllable of creation. Every stone carried a memory of divine speech. The oak, standing at the crossroads of worlds, was not merely a tree but a living axis, binding heaven and earth, and the unseen realms below. Rivers were messengers, carrying souls and secrets from one shore of being to another. The wind, moving through grass and mist, whispered the forgotten names of gods. To the Celtic mind, nature was an icon through which eternity shone. To walk through a forest or stand before the sea was not a passive act of admiration, it was prayer. The world itself was the first temple, and silence beneath its vaults was a form of worship. They believed that to understand nature was to read the divine language directly, not through written words, but through presence. The green earth was the altar, the sunlight, the eternal flame, and in every raindrop and gust of wind, they heard the same message repeated, that the world is alive, and that the sacred is not elsewhere, but here, breathing, shimmering, endlessly speaking through the face of creation. The north as a sacred direction once more. The image of the north arises austere, radiant, and eternal. It is the place where the world begins and where it quietly returns, the direction not of exile but of origin. The north, for the Celts, was memory itself, the remembrance of the first gods and of the moment when chaos first gave birth to light. In their myths, the north is not simply cold. It is clarity made visible. It is the land where the sun walks close to the edge of the world, where silence gleams like metal, and every breath feels like prayer. The north was not a geography to be crossed, but an initiation to be endured, a pilgrimage of the soul from confusion to illumination, From shadow to the bright stillness of divine order. To move northward was to move inward. The icy wind stripped the soul of illusion, revealing what was eternal beneath the spark that no frost could extinguish. In this journey, each step was both an act of remembrance and of creation. To name the divine was to recreate the cosmos, to set its order spinning once more. When a Celt spoke the name of a god, wrote Shirokova, he recreated the world anew. And as long as that name continues to sound, myth endures. And so does man. The North, then, is not the end of the road, but its beginning, the luminous threshold between man and eternity, between silence and the word that keeps the world alive. The Trinitarian world, Hume's formula between sea and wind, between blade and word. The spirit of the North is born where gods and heroes gaze at the same sky. In the depths of Indo-European memory lies a vision of the world not as chaos, but as harmony, a trinity of forces woven into the fabric of all existence. The French scholar Georges Dumesel saw this triad reflected across ancient mythologies, from the Vedas to the sagas, from Rome to Gaul. According to him, every true civilization of the North was built upon three sacred functions: the priestly, the warrior, and the fertile. The priestly function guarded the invisible order, the law of the cosmos, the bond between gods and men. The warrior function embodied strength and courage, the fire that defends the world from dissolution. And the fertile, productive function nourished life itself, the rhythm of the earth, the fields, the cattle, the hearth. Among the Celts and the Norse, these were not abstract categories, but living archetypes. In every tribe there was the Druid, keeper of knowledge and mediator with the unseen, the warrior, protector of the sacred order, and the farmer, who ensured the continuity of life, thought, action, and creation, the three breaths of one spirit, moving in a single circle. Dumsel's insight revealed that this triad was more than a social structure, it was a map of the cosmos, mirrored in human society. The gods themselves reflected it: Odin the sage, Thor the defender, Freyr the giver of fertility. So did the Celtic Pantheon, where the wisdom of the Druids, the valor of warriors, and the abundance of the earth formed one living organism. In this vision, the world stands balanced upon three pillars: mind, strength, and life, and when any of them falters, the cosmos trembles. The North remembered this secret longer than most, that harmony is not born of sameness, but of the eternal dance between wisdom, courage, and creation. Dagdo, La, and Odin, brothers of light and shadow, between the mist and the sword, between fire and silence. Three figures stand at the heart of the northern imagination: Dagdo, La, and Odin. They are not separate gods but reflections of one archetype: the father, the magician, and the hero, three flames born from the same divine breath that moves through all Indo-European myth. Dagda, and the Celtic world, is the great father. Paul Father before the North gave this name to Odin. He rules the cycles of life and death with a vast, slow wisdom. His cauldron never runs empty. It feeds both the living and the dead, for his abundance is the abundance of existence itself. He walks between the worlds as a shapeshifter, a being who holds within himself the fertile earth and the mystery of the grave. Like Odin, he knows that true power comes not from strength but from knowledge earned through descent into darkness. Dagda's laughter nourishes the fields, but his silence feeds the underworld. He is the first rhythm of creation, where death and life intertwine like roots in the same soil. La, the Shining One, is the craftsman of light, the god of skill, poetry, and war. In him, Every art becomes a form of worship. He wields the spear of the sun and the word as its echo. He is as radiant as Apollo and as cunning as Loki, carrying within him both the warmth of order and the spark of rebellion. La embodies the creative spirit that destroys only to rebuild more perfectly. His strength is harmony of the union of wisdom and courage, of mind and hand. Like Odin, he rules through intellect and will, commanding through the language of gods, yet his domain is not terror but brilliance. He is the craftsman hero who shapes reality through beauty. And then there is Odin, the wanderer, the whisperer, the god who sacrificed himself to himself. Hanging on the wine-torn tree, he found not death but vision. His eye, given to the well of memory, still looks into the abyss where knowledge begins. He is both the storm and the stillness after it. Odin's speech is spell and chain. His runes, like the words of the Celtic god Ogma, bind hearts and fates together. Both Odin and Ogma reveal the same mystery, that language is creation, and every word uttered in truth becomes an act of magic. To speak is to weave the world. Together, Dagda, La, and Odin form a northern trinity, a mythic current that flows beneath Celtic groves and Norse halls alike. Dagda gives life, La gives form, and Odin gives meaning. They are the sun at dawn, the fire at noon, and the ember at dusk. Their unity is the rhythm of all existence, the cycle of creation, mastery, and sacrifice, where the light descends into shadow only to rise again purified. In the end, they remind us that the divine is not perfect stillness but motion, an eternal pulse between birth and decay, between knowing and unknowing. For in every age, under every sky, the same truth burns quietly. Wisdom is born of sacrifice, and light is always carved from the heart of darkness. The Morrigan and the Valkyries, the feminine shadows of war. If the male gods embody action, then the female ones carry destiny. Where the warrior swings his sword, it is the goddess who decides where it will fall. Among the Celts, this power belonged to the Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, the goddess of battle, death, and prophecy. She is both terror and wisdom, both destroyer and midwife of transformation. In the mists of the northern sky, her reflection takes form as the Valkyries, Odin's daughters of battle, shining and spectral, who ride between worlds. Both choose the fallen. Both hover above the clash of armies, where the sound of swords mingles with the breath of the wind. One takes the shape of a raven, the other of a swan, yet both bear the same message, that death is not an end, but a threshold. The Morrigan, whose voice is the cry of the crow, whispers to heroes before dawn. She is the one who knows the outcome of every war long before the first blade is drawn. Her wings darken the sky not as a curse, but as a reminder that glory and mortality are bound by a single thread. The Valkyries, gleaming in silver light, are her northern sisters. They descend not to kill, but to escort, to lead the chosen into Valhalla, where feasting follows death and eternity begins in song. They are not the bringers of doom but of continuity, guardians of the cycle that turns blood into legend. Through them, the ancients felt the breath of the inevitable, the law that governs all existence, that every ending is a seed, every fall a preparation for rebirth. This is not cruelty, but the acceptance of the great circle, the truth that even in destruction there is grace, and even death carries its own light. For the raven and the swan are sisters, and their wings brush both worlds, one black, one white, both woven from the same wind. The symbol of the knot, the god who binds, Nina Shirokova writes of one of the most ancient sacred symbols, the knot, the thread, the binding. It is not a sign of dominance, but of connection, an invisible weave that holds existence together. The knot is the meeting point of opposites, the spirit tied to the body, chaos interlaced with order, life entwined with death. Across Indo-European myth, the gods who bind are among the most powerful. Odin binds with spells and runes. Varuna, the Vedic guardian of cosmic law, binds with cords of truth. And Ogma or Ogmius, the Celtic god of eloquence, binds with words. Each represents the same mystery, that to name something is to join it to the world, and to speak is to create the thread of destiny. In Shirakova's interpretation, this image of binding is not about enslavement, but about the sacred interdependence of all beings. Nothing in the universe exists in isolation. Every star pulls another by an unseen line. Every thought becomes a ripple that ties the living to the dead, the human to the divine. The knot is the form of harmony, the shape of the cosmos itself. To the Celts, these bindings were visible everywhere, in their endless spirals and interlaced ornaments, in the woven patterns that filled their art and weapons. The knot, to them, was a cosmic equation, a symbol of the truth that everything that has been created endures only while its threads remain entwined. And perhaps this is the final secret hidden in their myth, that the world itself is a sacred knot, held together by breath, memory, and meaning. So long as the knot remains unbroken, the universe endures. The gods do not rule the world, they hold it together. Every word, every gesture, every love, is another thread in the fabric of being. The hero archetype from Celtic to the Berserker in the mythic landscapes of the Celts and the Northmen. The hero is never merely a warrior, he is the chosen one. The human who crosses the threshold between the mortal and the divine. His battle is not only against enemies, but against the limits of his own being. Celtic, the radiant champion of Ulster, is said to have been born of light itself, a son of divine brilliance and human will. In him burns a fury that is not rage but revelation. When the Riastrid, the battle madness, seizes him, his body twists into monstrous beauty. One eye sinks into his skull while the other bulges with fire. His blood sings, his hair becomes flames. This is not violence. It is transfiguration, a moment when spirit devours flesh and man becomes more than man. In the north, his mirror stands in the figure of the Berserker, the ecstatic warrior of Odin, whose fury is not madness but communion. He sheds his humanity to merge with the beast, the bear or the wolf, channeling the energy of creation itself. Like Celtic, the Berserker fights in a trance. His strength comes not from discipline but from surrender, from dissolving into the storm. Both heroes walk the same narrow path, that of the holy madness furor sasser, where pain becomes vision, and death becomes initiation. They are bridges between worlds, fusing light and darkness, life and destruction, until these opposites reveal themselves as one. In them, the Indo-European myth remembers its oldest dream that the true warrior does not kill to conquer, but to awaken. His battle is not for land, but for meaning. His victory is not survival, but integration, the uniting of strength and wisdom, blood and word, chaos and harmony. Thus is born the archetype of the integrating hero, the one who burns so brightly that he becomes a mirror for the divine. Through his struggle, he restores the balance of worlds, proving that even fury can be sacred, and even destruction can be a form of creation. In the heart of every true warrior, the storm is not his enemy, it is the voice of the gods calling him home. The Otherworld, and the fate of the chosen. In both Celtic and Norse cosmologies, death is not an ending, it is an elevation. To die in battle is not a tragedy, but the final act of consecration, a passage into the radiant eternity reserved for the chosen. For the Norse, Odin himself selects the fallen, guiding them to Valhalla, the hall of the slain. There, amidst the golden shields and endless feasting, warriors fight and die again each day, only to rise reborn by nightfall, their wounds healed, their spirits aflame. It is not punishment, but an eternal rite, an unending rehearsal for Ragnarok, the last battle where gods and men will stand side by side. Among the Celts, a parallel vision unfolds. Beyond rivers veiled in mist lies the Cid, the Otherworld, a realm not of darkness, but of perpetual dawn. It is the domain of gods and heroes who have transcended decay. There, feasts never end, music never ceases, and the light has no source but the soul itself. To enter the Cid is to awaken from death, to remember that life was only a shadow of something greater. These twin visions of Valhalla and the Cid reflect one and the same truth, that life never ceases. It merely changes form, like light dissolving into snow or fire into breath. The warrior's death is not annihilation but transformation, the soul's migration into the eternal rhythm of creation. The Norse and the Celts did not fear death because they saw through it. They understood that the world breathes through cycles of sacrifice and renewal. The chosen do not die. They cross the threshold and become the pulse of the cosmos itself. The gods of the North and the Celts are not neighbors, but mirrors, reflections of one reality. Their myths are not tales, but memory, the memory of a time when man still knew to conquer death. One must learn to bind with the sword, with the word, and with love. Ornament and abstract thought. It is not man who creates the ornament, it is the ornament that reveals man. In every curve breathes the world, in every line the memory of a star's movement. Celtic art is not decoration. It is a way of thinking through form, a meditation where line becomes prayer and the spiral becomes the image of time itself. Where the Greek mind sought perfect proportion, the Celtic spirit sought infinity. For the Celt, order was alive, fluid like a river that never repeats its bend, yet is always recognizable by its rhythm. As Nina Shirokova observes, the abstract nature of Celtic ornament is not a denial of reality, but its transcendence. Here, art does not imitate nature, because nature is already sacred. The artist's task is not to represent but to reveal, to let the hidden geometry of the world shimmer through the pattern. Every spiral, every woven thread in Celtic design is a metaphor for the interconnection of all things. There is no center, no edge, only movement, continuity, and return. It is a visual theology of the circle, where all beings are gods, humans, animals, stars participate in the same eternal rhythm. In these infinite patterns, we glimpse a worldview where chaos and harmony are not opposites, but partners in an endless dance. The knot, the curve, the weave, they are not ornaments upon reality. They are reality. Through them, the Celts spoke the silent language of the cosmos, a language written not in words, but in the turning of light and line, where the universe itself becomes the artist. The magic of form and symmetry. The Celts saw form as an incantation. A line did not merely outline an object, it embraced it, protected it, transformed it into a symbol. Every curve was a spell, every contour a gesture of reverence toward the unseen. Their symmetry was not mathematical but ritual. It was not about balance of shapes, but about balance of worlds, between earth and the other world, between time and eternity, between spirit and matter. To draw was to act in the cosmic order. Geometry was liturgy. The ancient craftsmen understood that a touch of imperfection brings life. If the pattern were too precise, too divine, it would cease to breathe. And so in every spiral, and every knot, there is a slight deviation, a trembling line, a pause, a tiny asymmetry. It is not an error, but a sign, a reminder that perfection belongs only to the gods, while man's role is to seek it. Through these deliberate irregularities, the Celts whispered a profound truth, that beauty lives not in the static, but in the living motion between order and freedom. Their art was a dialogue between the finite and the infinite, the momentary and the eternal. In each pattern, half ritual, half revelation, they captured the secret pulse of the world, a symmetry that breathes, a form that prays. The aesthetics of movement and transformation. There is no stillness in Celtic art. Every line seems alive, trembling with motion, curving as if it has a pulse. Each pattern breathes, expands, contracts. It flows, like wind bending the grass or a vortex twisting in the northern sky. To look upon it is to feel movement itself made visible. The Celts did not seek beauty in symmetry or still perfection, they sought it in the moment of transformation. In that sacred instant when one thing becomes another. This vision, as Shirokova notes, reflects a worldview built on flux rather than form. For the Celt, nothing in the universe was ever truly fixed. The world was not a sculpture, but a living tapestry, the constant weaving and unweaving of energies, a conversation between visible and invisible. Even the gods, in this mythology, are not static entities but forces in motion, appearing, fading, returning under new names, as the seasons themselves are reborn in endless procession. Hence the Celtic fascination with transitional forms, those shapes that seem caught mid-metamorphosis. The animal becomes a vine, its body elongating into spiral tendrils. The vine curls into a wave. The wave, in turn, softens into the outline of a human face. There is no fracture between them, no boundary line, only flow, a continual passage of life through life. It is an art without hierarchies, where every being shares the same sacred breath. In this vision of flowing forms, we find a philosophy of the fluid soul. Everything that lives is but a temporary configuration of eternal movement, a ripple on the ocean of being. Death, therefore, is not an end but a change of pattern, a return to the rhythm that births all forms anew. The Celts understood this with an artist's intuition, that motion itself is divine, and that only the stillness of the dead line betrays the living world it seeks to portray. Celtic art, then, is not an image of the world but its echo in motion, a spiritual cartography of change. To trace its spirals is to follow the dance of creation, to feel how the universe breathes through every curve. It is a silent theology of becoming, a reminder that nothing truly rests, and that even in stillness, the spirit continues to move. Sacred symbols in Celtic art. A Celtic art was never created for beauty alone. It was not decoration, it was ritual made visible. Every curve, every symbol, every interlacing thread carried memory of gods, of worlds, of the pulse that joined heaven and earth. The Celts understood form as a sacred vessel. To shape it was to summon the divine. To carve it was to call upon the old powers sleeping in stone and metal. Each sign held a cosmological meaning. The triple knot represented the three fundamental forces, the priestly, the warrior, and the fertile, the reflection of Doomsel's triad, where power, courage, and life form the sacred harmony of the universe. The spiral, ever turning, embodied the law of eternal return, creation, dissolution, and rebirth in endless motion. The serpentine line symbolized transformation, the flow of time, and the shedding of forms, reminding that even death is only another beginning. The cross within the circle, later echoed in Christian symbolism, united the four elements around the world's axis, a map of cosmos and soul, where all paths converge at the center. As Shirokova observes, these were not ornaments to please the eye, they were portals for the spirit. To gaze upon them was to cross into another reality, to touch that invisible architecture of existence which the ordinary eye cannot see. Each pattern acted as a passageway, a geometric prayer leading inward, toward the still point where the human and the divine meet. In this sense, Celtic art was a liturgy of vision. It did not illustrate myth, it was myth, embodied in form and line. Every symbol was a bridge between worlds, every object a consecrated vessel of meaning. When the craftsman shaped a spiral or traced the path of a serpent, he was not creating, he was remembering. And through that remembrance, the sacred became visible again. To stand before such art is to feel that invisible vibration, the whisper of the old mystery. That form is prayer, that beauty is invocation, and that through the simplest line, eternity reveals itself. The North as the spiritual archetype of Europe. The North is not a place on the map. It is a direction of the soul, where cold becomes purification, where light is born from darkness, where in silence one can hear the breath of eternity. To the ancient Greeks, the North was Ultima Thule, the last shore of the world, a realm beyond human measure. It was the land of winds and wonders, where God spoke through snow and stars. To them, it marked the boundary between the known and the unimaginable. Yet for the European spirit that followed, the North became not the end, but the beginning, not exile, but origin. The North is more than geography. It is an inner ascent, a metaphysical direction. It calls one toward clarity, toward the essence of things stripped bare. In the North, truth is not given, it is earned through endurance. Light is not bestowed, it must be wrested from the darkness. And man, standing alone before silence and vastness, becomes whole. This northern axis is not coldness, but purification, a shedding of excess, a return to the elemental. It is faith in what is simple, steadfast, and eternal. The winds of the North do not destroy, they refine. They strip away illusion until only essence remains, a heart quiet enough to hear the ancient rhythm of the world. From this silence arose the Nordic tradition, not as a mythology of frost, but as a philosophy of endurance and awakening. In it, knowledge is not abstract theory, but a state of being, clarity as virtue, solitude as teacher, and light as the final revelation. The North is not merely a place where the world ends, it is where the soul begins. The North as the spiritual archetype of Europe. The North is not a place on the map. It is a direction of the soul, where cold becomes purification, where light is born from darkness, where in silence one can hear the breath of eternity. To the ancient Greeks, the North was Ultima Thule, the last shore of the world, a realm beyond human measure. It was the land of winds and wonders, where God spoke through snow and stars. To them, it marked the boundary between the known and the unimaginable. Yet for the European spirit that followed, the North became not the end, but the beginning, not exile, but origin. The North is more than geography. It is an inner ascent, a metaphysical direction. It calls one toward clarity, toward the essence of things stripped bare. In the North, truth is not given, it is earned through endurance. Light is not bestowed, it must be wrested from the darkness. And man, standing alone before silence and vastness, becomes whole. This northern axis is not coldness, but purification, a shedding of excess, a return to the elemental. It is faith in what is simple, steadfast, and eternal. The winds of the north do not destroy. They refine. They strip away illusion until only essence remains, a heart quiet enough to hear the ancient rhythm of the world. From this silence arose the Nordic tradition, not as a mythology of frost, but as a philosophy of endurance and awakening. In it, knowledge is not abstract theory, but a state of being, clarity as virtue, solitude as teacher, and light as the final revelation. The North is not merely a place where the world ends, it is where the soul begins. The meaning of the Nordic tradition in modern cultural consciousness today. As civilization once again stands on a threshold between technology and spirit, between speed and meaning, the Nordic tradition returns as a quiet reminder. It speaks in a voice both ancient and immediate. True strength is not in domination, but in inner clarity, not in noise, but in the stillness that allows truth to breathe. To walk the northern path is to learn that the sun is not something to worship, it is something to carry within. When the world around descends into night, modern culture, weary of its own acceleration, begins to long again for the simplicity of the ancient north, for that transparent silence in which the heart can be heard, for the wisdom that arrives through cold and solitude, for the beauty that does not shout, but breathes. The north, once thought barren, becomes once more a source of renewal, the space where meaning can take root after the storm. Thus, the Nordic archetype returns not as a legend of gods and heroes, but as a state of consciousness, steadiness amidst change, clarity amidst confusion, purity amidst excess. It is a way of being that resists fragmentation and remembers the wholeness of things. When we look toward the north, we do not only remember the past, we remember our calling. For where the world ends, the spirit begins. The story of the Celts and the Nordic tradition is not merely a tale of forgotten gods or vanished tribes. It is a mirror held up to our own time, a reminder that beneath every invention, every rush toward progress, there still beats the same ancient rhythm of the earth. The North, in its silence, never stopped speaking. It whispers through snow and stone, through forgotten myths and living souls. Through the quiet courage of those who seek light without fear of darkness, we live, once again, in an age of noise, yet the wisdom of the North endures precisely because it was born from silence. It tells us that clarity is not found in abundance, but in restraint. That strength is not loud. That beauty does not demand to be seen, it reveals itself to those who can wait. And so, when we turn our eyes to the North, we do not look for direction, we look for depth. We listen for that subtle breath that once moved through the forests of Gaul, through the halls of the Druids, through the hearts of poets and warriors who carried fire within the frost. The North is not a place, it is a memory, a calling, a return. And perhaps, in remembering it, we remember ourselves, for the world was never truly divided, only our sight was. And when the mists of the North lift, we will see the dawn was always there,